Hello everyone, welcome to the third Public Diplomacy Week. I am Chun Su-jin and I'm a reporter with 중앙일보 or Jungang Daily here in Seoul. We are going to talk about the international views on Korea from, of course, the BTS and from the film Parasite, and also a little more serious topics such as the alliance between Seoul and Washington, D.C. And to do that, we have a perfect group of speakers today from Seoul, of course, and from London, and all the way from Chicago. So let me first introduce you to our speakers. And first on my left, we have Victoria Kim, who is the Seoul Bureau Chief of the LA Times. Hello, Victoria.
Hello.
And via Zoom, we have, I believe, Jonathan McClory from all the way from London, right? So good afternoon, Jonathan.
Hello.
So great to have you. And also in Chicago, we have Karl with the Chicago Council of Global Affairs. Hello, Karl.
Good morning.
So without further ado, let us first hear from our great panelists. And I guess, why don't we start with you, Karl? And you have 5 minutes. So please.
First, thanks to all the panelists and to the Korea Foundation, especially for their continued support. Today, I'm going to be talking about the results from a recent survey we did of the American public on their attitudes towards Korea. And that's really not possible without the support of the Korea Foundation. So it's highly appreciated. One of the top line findings from our survey this year was that the favorability of South Korea has reached an all-time high. We asked this on a 0 to 100 scale, and this year South Korea received a mean score of 60. And there are lots of reasons, I think, that are for that. And we'll hear from, I think, the other panelists about these reasons more in depth. But just to quickly touch on them all, of course, we have the COVID-19 response, which South Korea has done very well. K-pop continues to show up on the Billboard charts, and in many cases as the #1 at the top of the charts. K-dramas are being brought into American homes by Netflix in a way that's never been done before. Of course, you mentioned Parasite in the opening about last year winning the Oscar. And let's not forget that when the reopening started after the kind of first wave of the pandemic, that it was Korean baseball that was the first sport to hit American TVs. And it garnered quite a bit of attention. Now, oftentimes when we look at these numbers, you can think that, well, if the number's at 60, perhaps you have a big gap that some people say they give it an 80 and some people give it a 40 and that it averages out. But when we break these numbers down between Republicans and Democrats, the interesting thing is that they're basically exactly the same. So there is no real partisan gap on this. And that's something that you might not expect if you've been following President Trump's rhetoric towards South Korea. Now, why is this important? And of course, anytime you look at favorability, the question is, why does this really matter? Do Americans know where the Koreas are, the Korean Peninsula is on a map, for example? I think that somewhat misses the point because some of this can really have downstream effects. And one of the places that we're going to see this effect is in American attitudes on practicing free trade. When we look at South Korea is also at an all-time high, seen as a fair trade partner. And we know this because a lot of the academic literature on this is highly entangled with favorability. So if you're seen as a favorable country, Americans are also going to see you as a fair trading partner, and that can have real impact on the way that an administration is going to approach another country and deal with that. Of course, if we talked about South Korea, one of the key parts of the alliance is the ability to defend, or the willingness to defend South Korea. And here too, Americans are really willing to defend South Korea if it were invaded by North Korea. And that number is at 58%. It's still a majority and has been a majority for the past 3 to 4 years. Before it was always under 50%. Now, on North Korea, unlike South Korea, which is at an all-time high in terms of favorability, North Korea is actually at an all-time low at 19. It's reached this number before, but we start to see that Americans really are not favorable towards North Korea, no matter kind of what North Korea is going to do. Even if there are a lack of provocations, that's not really recovering. A large part of this is due to its nuclear program, of course. 51% of Americans say that North Korea's nuclear program is a critical threat, but that's down from something like 75% in 2017 when we were at the height of the fire and fury and provocations were ongoing, and it looked like there was a considerable chance of war between the two countries. Now, even though Americans, a majority of Americans still say that North Korea's nuclear program is a critical threat, the question, I think the natural question is then, what should the United States do about it? And when it comes to this, the Americans have what I kind of term as the three cannots. We can't accept it. 55% oppose accepting North Korea as a nuclear-armed country. We can't bomb it. There's very little support for any type of military intervention or military attack on North Korea to forcefully denuclearize it. And the third one is we can't negotiate. That there's just 14% think that negotiations with North Korea will lead to denuclearization. And I would argue that this is quite a savvy understanding from the American public, right? Because it shows that they kind of clearly understand that North Korea is an incredibly difficult problem, and there really is no good solution one way or the other to eventually reaching denuclearization. And by the way, there's also not much support for a freeze for freeze, the so-called freeze for freeze, where we would say, all right, you can keep your current nuclear weapons, but just don't produce any more of them. So it really is a land of no good opportunity in dealing with North Korea, and the American public understands that. Just as one final thought on the broader takeaway from some of this data, it's been an ongoing, kind of a joke among the Korean analysts as we've been watching the Korean Peninsula, and you think about the American public. We often hear, the ongoing joke is that, well, when you talk about North Korea or South Korea, well, which one is that? Is that the good one or the bad one? And I think now that the data is starting to show that we're really moving beyond that. The fact that, we don't see this confusion, especially in terms of favorability between North and South Korea, that South Korea is going to be clearly favorable, and I think that's going to last over a much longer period, and that there's a clear understanding that North Korea is a bad actor in the international community, a rival to the United States, and I think that's going to stick as well. I'll go ahead and wrap up there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karl. And now please allow me to move on. It's time to hear from Jonathan.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. The last one that we did was 2019. And even though I'm sure coronavirus gets blamed for all kinds of delays and setbacks with projects, we haven't done one this year. And I'm actually in the process of trying to completely overhaul the project. But I still think there's value looking at some of the data from last year and getting a sense of where Korea's strengths and weaknesses are when it comes to soft power. The Soft Power 30, for those perhaps watching who didn't join or participate in last year's event, the Soft Power 30 is a composite index that combines both objective and international polling data to arrive at a ranking system that compares the soft power assets of different countries, and allows us to look at some of the things that we can actually touch and feel and count, and what are the different levers that policymakers have to pull when it comes to soft power. But recognizing the inherent subjectivity of soft power, it also captures global public opinion data to get a sense of what countries have to work with when trying to attract and persuade others. What's interesting about Korea for the last year that we have data is that it's the best year that it's had. So Korea finished 19th out of a total of 60 countries for which we collect data. That's the best it's done. And up from last year. And the really interesting thing about Korea's performance is there's quite a divergence when we look at the objective data versus the international polling data. So on the objective data, which encompasses metrics on things like quality of government, international engagement, kind of diplomatic network, things like that, culture, education, enterprise, and digital. When we look at these different categories, and each of those functions like its own mini index, if you will, Korea does very, very well on the digital component of the index. So it's 5th out of 60 countries for digital, which shouldn't really surprise us. The only area where it comes to digital where perhaps Korea could do a little bit better would be on digital diplomacy and the global engagement that the government does on various social network platforms. It could be a bit better there, but in terms of tech and innovation and its digital infrastructure, it's pretty hard to beat Korea. It also does very well on enterprise. It's seen as being a great place to do business. Its capacity for innovation is very well known. It's also been climbing up the table on culture quite a bit. So ranking 12th this year overall on culture. And I think a big part of that, obviously, is the success of Korea's music industry, but also the recent success that the film industry has had as well. To say nothing of the Korean TV soaps. And other areas where South Korea has been performing better are on engagement, and this is essentially global engagement. So like I said, diplomatic footprints, the extent to which a country is contributing well and positively in the world, things like environmental leadership. And then also government. So this captures both political values and also the quality of government. What are the level of outcomes that a government is delivering for its citizens? And South Korea has been improving year over year on this category as well. But then when we look at the international polling data, there are a few categories on the polling data where South Korea does very well, particularly on technology exports, which again shouldn't really surprise us. But then it kind of falls off a bit from there. And when we look in aggregate at the polling data, it seems like Korea is outperforming on the objective side of the assets that we look at and underperforming on the polling. So I think there's a job to do for all of the different parts of the government, but also NGOs and businesses to really try and close that gap and make sure that South Korea is getting credit for those tangible soft power assets that it does have. I think I'll probably leave it there and we can cover more in the discussion.
Sure. Thank you so much, Jonathan. And now let's finally talk about the BTS. And for that, let me move on to Victoria. So Victoria, could you tell us for about 5 minutes, please?
Well, thank you for having me. Let me pivot a little bit and talk less so specifically about BTS, but more about culture's role generally and perceptions of Korea to the outside world. And for me, in thinking about Korean pop culture's resonance in the world, I find myself going back to a conversation I had this February on the day that Parasite won Best Picture in the Academy Awards in a hilly neighborhood in Seoul. This is a man who had watched the film 4 times because he saw so much of his personal life reflected in the movie. He saw the fumigation trucks of his childhood. He saw the hills where he makes his deliveries every day. He saw the economic disparities that are very much a part of life in Seoul today. And it was astonishing to him and stunning that something that resonated with him on such a personal and intimate level had such universal appeal. And this was the film that made this seemingly historic breakthrough. And Parasite's director, Bong Joon-ho, has also talked about the fact that he had, in recent years, made films with Hollywood actors involving English dialogue, and yet it was this movie, this latest one, that was wholly Korean in language and setting and all the cultural references that seemed to resonate far and beyond what the other movies had reached. And he, after one of the many award ceremonies, he remarked that the film's success made him think that perhaps the deeper I delve into things that are around me, the broader the story can become and the more appeal it can have to the international audience. And perhaps we could say something similar about South Korea's first global viral hit, Psy's Gangnam Style in 2012. And up until that point, many music executives, producers had made such concerted efforts, invested a lot of time and effort and money into trying to break into markets that previously seemed inaccessible to Korean artists, namely the American and Western consumers. And yet, despite all those concerted efforts, it was this very quirky, comedic, and artist who had this piece that was, in many ways, a social commentary about a neighborhood in Seoul that many continue to mispronounce to this day. And he was the one that had made the breakthrough and arguably heralded the rise of K-pop as both a genre and a phenomenon. And perhaps it's somewhat ironic and readily apparent, but this broadening appeal of South Korea's pop culture, music, film, and literature seems to be a lot less about a result of concerted government initiatives or investments, and much more about people simply doing what they do best and trusting their creative vision and doing their creative work in their various sectors of the world. And this resonance seems to be a lot less about taking something that's Korean and translating it or making it accessible or to the wider public, and a lot more about telling stories, creating music, and innovating in a way that is true to the moment that's lived by Koreans presently in Korea. And it's probably inarguable and without doubt that the prominence of Korea's cultural products around the world shape Korea's image to the outside world, that it makes its products more desirable, that it makes it more attractive as a destination, and in many ways also makes its government or its political system an object of aspiration. And that's something that's seen in the way Korean movies and music are playing a role in some democratic movements in different parts of Asia. But there does seem to be, in some ways, a misconception that the role that these cultural products should play is casting South Korea in a favorable or a desirable light. But I think much more powerful is when they reflect South Korea's society, people, and its struggles as they are today. When I was starting out reporting in Los Angeles many years ago, I wrote about a Korean woman who had started an empire of successful Korean restaurants based on a very humble Korean dish called sundubu. And in this instance, she didn't, even though it was a dish that was not very well known, she didn't make it any less spicy or anything less than scaldingly hot as it's supposed to be served. And yet it attracted a very diverse clientele in Los Angeles. There was a wait around the clock, branches opened up all across the US, and it had Americans craving flavors that they didn't know to crave before. And that takes me back to the man that I met in February who makes rice deliveries in Seoul, and that despite what he may think, that it's because of how much the film resonated with him, not in spite of the fact that it was so deeply personal to him, that it had the universal appeal that it did. And the same could probably be said about a number of other cultural Korean cultural products. Those are some introductory thoughts, and I'm very much looking forward to discussing it further with you two.
Let me ask you, well, to build up on your discussions, let me ask you about several questions, and please allow me to start with you again, Karl. So as a reporter, I've been covering diplomacy for more than 10 years by now, and a non-partisan institution like yours has been doing these surveys for more than 10 years, right?
Since 1974, actually.
74.
So, yeah, we're getting close to 50 years. Not every year, but every 4 years, and then every 2 years, and now every year.
Wow. So that is a pretty time-honored kind of survey, I would say. So, and I really appreciate the survey because, it has been giving me a lot of insight on what is really going on in Seoul and Washington. And actually, that's not just me, I guess, because your survey results have been quoted by so many media outlets, right? Including the Washington Post and the New York Times, to name a few. Out of so many numbers from your survey, one number just I thought it was really meaningful because over 90% of South Koreans surveyed, they said they embrace the alliance with the United States. So what do you think, or how do you read the number?
I've been doing surveys in Korea, including when I was based there, since 2013. In almost every survey we did, support for the alliance was above 90%. So we're going on 7 to 8 years running. But I would add one caveat that the word that is used in the Korean language surveys is not necessarily support. Instead, it's necessity. Right? So is it necessary to have this? And that, I think, is the one important thing to understand. But then you get into a conversation about, well, what makes it necessary? Is it the threat from North Korea that makes it necessary? or is it the threat from China? And actually what we're discovering as we dig into the data a little bit more, it's partly North Korea, but the bigger picture is actually China, that there is a latent perceived threat from China. And so even if the North Korea threat is removed, I'm not fully convinced that this support for the US alliance will suddenly collapse, right? It'll go down certainly from 90%, but it won't go down to suddenly 20% or somewhere down there. It'll stay relatively strong.
There are so many important numbers in your survey, and one of them, to me personally, is that over 60% of the Americans answered, who were surveyed by you, said that they are willing to defend South Korea when it's under attack, right? What should we learn from this?
Yeah, so this goes back to something I mentioned before, that when you look at numbers, if you have a number that's really high, say 90%, you know that there's going to be very little variation between demographics, right? So you could break it down by gender, you could break it down by race, you could break it down by partisanship, but 90% is going to be really solid because you can't get to 90% with having these wide gaps in numbers. But 60% is a little bit soft, that you can have these wide gaps. But when we break it down, we don't see those gaps emerge. Instead, we see that Republicans and Democrats are very in line with their willingness to support South Korea. And so I think that speaks to the overall robustness of that number, the fact that the American public is behind South Korea, and more importantly, that the way that President Trump has handled South Korea hasn't had any effect, not only on Democrats. We would expect it to have the opposite effect on Democrats, but it's also had the opposite effect on Republicans, that when he's attacked things like South Korea, we see support for South Korea go up. When he's attacked things like free trade or trading with allies or trade deficits, we see support for trade and international economy actually go up. So the only place we haven't seen that happen is on China, where he's taken a much harder line on China, and actually we see the public kind of moving along with him. Republicans are moving faster, but Democrats are trailing not too far behind.
Okay, thank you so much, Karl.
Thank you.
So now I guess it's time to move on to London. Jonathan, how did you come up with this index, the idea of this index to begin with?
Well, thanks very much for the question. So the index has a long history, and it goes back not as long as the Karl's survey, the Chicago Council, but it goes back more than a decade. So when I was working at a think tank here in London called the Institute for Government, and while I was there, I'd done a bit of work in the kind of public diplomacy and soft power space, and the IFG is a very data-intensive think tank, and I kind of found myself wondering, had anybody tried to come up with a kind of measurement framework that could be used to compare the soft power of countries? And to my surprise, nobody really had done. So actually, I hadn't been in touch with him before, but reached out to Joseph Nye at Harvard University, who coined the phrase, and sort of, explained who I was and what I was doing, and asked him if he tried to, put together a measurement framework, or had he seen one that he particularly rated. And he said, no, I haven't. And if you're thinking of doing it, I'd encourage you to do it. And so with that, I then set off to try and do that. And it was a very tedious exercise that just took a lot of reviewing of the academic literature, or building on the work that Joseph Nye had done, and many other researchers and academics who were trying to pinpoint some of the either policies or aspects of a country that have an impact on global perceptions. And once I kind of had a decent understanding of that, then it was, then the tedium really began, trying to find, different possible metrics that where there was enough comparable data across countries, and then just trying to build it out. And what I suppose I wanted to do really was find a way to bring that objective data together with some subjective data. And initially, when I was at the Institute for Government, that wasn't polling; it was more of kind of an elite panel, if you like. And then the project has gone through a couple of iterations. There was the launch of it with the IFG, and then about 5 years later, when I was with Portland, we were able to then fund some polling basically and sort of relaunched it as the Soft Power 30. And right now I'm actually in the process of thinking about the next iteration, because I think the world has moved on so much, not just in the last 5 years, but in the last 10 months. It's moved on incredibly, and so I've actually started that process of thinking about what the next iteration of a measurement framework could be that try and capture some of these changes. And so together with our friends at the University of Southern California Center on Public Diplomacy, we've just launched a global series of roundtable discussions with researchers and practitioners in particularly public diplomacy and soft power, and we're kind of trying to pick apart some of these questions and issues as we cope not only with the pandemic and what that means for how countries are seen, but also how they engage with the outside world, as well as a new presidential administration. So that's kind of the backstory to the index, and it will hopefully by next year then emerge in its third iteration.
To have a better or more exact result, a more precise result, I learned that you are updating how you make those data, right? So could you elaborate more on that, please?
Sure, yeah. Well, one of the things we've been doing with these, the global roundtables, and we've held 2 of them now, and the idea is to hold a number of them in different regions of the world. And one of the things we're trying to do is get a sense of how or rather, has there been change, and if so, how much and in what ways? How, in terms of how people, how they think about countries, how they perceive them, in terms of favorability, and we've asked these groups, and the majority in the 2 groups that we've run so far, one being in the UK and the other one being in Japan. A majority in both of those groups did feel that the way that they think about countries has changed, and sort of the drivers of opinion have changed. And while there's agreement, it's a bit too early to know exactly what that is. I think, it's 2 things primarily. One is overall government competence is much more important, I think, in terms of how people shape an opinion of a country. They want to know that it's going to be effective when it needs to, mobilize in the response of a pandemic or something like that. Public health is going to be really important, kind of, and infrastructure as well. These things that sort of reassure people and give a sense of a benevolent government that's in charge and can protect its people. I think that'll be great for countries like South Korea. There've been a few commentaries from people like Michael Fullilove at the Lowy Institute in Australia, Dan Dresdner in the Washington Post, talking about how effective middle powers that are really competent, how much it has benefited their reputation, and South Korea is definitely one of those countries. So I think competence is going to be a big factor, but we have to test that. I have sort of emerging thoughts and answers, but I don't have anything concrete yet, which we are certainly working on.
I see. Well, thank you for the answers. And as you previously explained, South Korea, in the latest survey result, it had the all-time high, right? 19th place. So what kind of factors contributed to that rise in your view?
Sure. So on the objective side of the data, it was the engagement sub-index, which I mentioned in my opening remarks, are things like diplomatic footprint, showing positive leadership on global issues, moving towards sustainability or combating climate change, those sorts of positive contributions that a country makes. Korea has been moving up on those in the right direction. Likewise, it's moved up in the government sub-index, which captures things like political values, but also that issue of competence, government effectiveness. But those have been quite incremental, a couple of positions. Where South Korea has started to improve, and admittedly from kind of a low base, is around the international polling. So I think that's had the biggest impact in getting Korea to climb up to a 19th place finish for the most recent Soft Power 30 study. So I think it was 2017 that Korea if you look as aggregated across all the polling, finished 28th. Whereas I believe this year, or 2019 study, it was 23rd, I believe, for the polling. So it's quite, in a short span of time, that's a pretty solid jump up for international polling. Now, as I said in my opening remarks, there's still a job to do in closing the gap between quite a really solid performance on a number of the objective categories and then where Korea positions with international polling. I guess the good news is that the direction of travel is a positive one, but there's still a lot of work to do there.
So how can we go higher up in the ladder?
Sure. South Korea needs to grab a hold of one big issue. I mean, the pandemic could be one because Korea's done relatively well, and be seen to really moving the needle in global terms. I think I would imagine, I mean, I'd be interested to know what Karl thinks about this, but I think most people, most global audiences, when they think of Korea, if it's not the kind of big cultural stuff, they think about it in terms of the Korean Peninsula conflict, and they think of it with respect to North Korea. That's a problem for South Korea. It distracts from all the great things because it's such a sticky challenge. But if South Korea could grab a hold and really lead on one big issue, I think that would be very helpful to have a more positive issue to really own beyond just the way that the whole Korean Peninsula conflict kind of dominates the way people think about the country.
A little bit more specific, Jonathan, because okay, well, for example, on Facebook or on Instagram or on Twitter, let's say, well, what should Korea's say Blue House or Foreign Ministry should do to better, well, the current social networking service?
Not just for digital diplomacy, but how countries engage with global audiences, or how governments engage with global audiences more broadly. There's a risk when it is the government being seen to lead on all the promotion efforts, because it starts to creep into a kind of propaganda space, or it's easily dismissed. As I said, there's so much creative talent in South Korea that the Blue House or Mofa or individual embassies and missions, they could simply be a platform to showcase other things that are happening. So things that exist outside government. And here in the UK, which has plenty of image problems right now, which we could spend all afternoon unpacking. But one of the things that they have done in the past, anyway, I wouldn't say the current administration or even the Theresa May government, but under David Cameron, the creation of this great campaign, one of the things that they did very well was to use these government resources as a platform to showcase parts of either the private sector or the philanthropic sector or whatever it might be, and almost kind of just use their resources to put the spotlight on other parts of the country that are more attractive, and they kind of avoided that trap, I think, very well, of being too feeling too much like propaganda.
So now please allow me to move on to our last but not the least speaker, Victoria. So in your opening remarks, you talked about Psy, right? About the Gangnam style. Of course, it's as you said, it's mispronounced, right? It's Gangnam, not Gangnam, but still. So all the reporters in South Korea reported that Psy's Gangnam Style had this hit on YouTube. Wow! But we never imagined that Brazilians, New Yorkers, Parisians would line up all night just to get one ticket to the BTS concert, right? And I guess there was kind of a quantum jump kind of revolution, I would say, over the past 5 or 6 years, to give birth to this BTS phenomenon. What do you think contributed to this whole revolution, I would say?
I think it is those individual moments like when Psy's hit went viral, that when there are breakthroughs with particular artists or novelists or filmmakers, that when one thing breaks through, that leads to consumers looking for other works by the same artist or things that are similar, that touch on the same genre. And I think in addition to those moments that have really exponentially grown South Korea's cultural product reaching outside audiences. I do think, I mean, Jonathan was talking a little bit about social media, in that in many ways, well, K-pop in particular was very well suited to this moment in social media, both in terms of things like Twitter or Instagram, but also very much so YouTube. I think that's the way that a lot of people discover K-pop and then start, and a lot of that also has to do with sort of the army of volunteers who volunteer their time and subtitle these videos, you know, dig into the lyrics, like tell you things about individual members that they find attractive or have certain affinity towards, and those are probably, you know, the things that have compounded to this cultural moment. I can't begin to say that explains it all, because I do think it is something that's, you know, kind of amazing and organic. As I was saying, that I don't think it really has to do with you know, any initiatives or any particular investments, but it has really happened because of, you know, individuals doing interesting creative work, and that's just found an audience elsewhere that's outside of Korea.
Yeah, and well, you brought up ARMY fans, right? And they are so devoted. I mean, like having all those subtitles and all those explanations, and let me send kudos to all those like ARMY fans, but there are like dozens and like several dozens, I would say, of like boy bands in South Korea, not just South Korea, Japan, and many other parts of the world. But what makes it so special about BTS?
I can't say I can quite explain the magic of BTS that seems to have happened. One thing that was impressive that happened earlier this year was some of the organizational prowess. The social media organization of these fans really came to the fore and was really manifest before the American public when they organized behind certain causes, raised, I believe, more than $1 million in donations for certain political causes, and that sort of showed you what power they had, and that is probably partly to explain for the fact that if you are, you know, as they say, standing a certain group or member, that you would share that love and sort of make a concerted effort to draw attention to that member or song or whatnot. You know, that doesn't explain it fully, because that doesn't really even begin to explain it, because at the core you have to have a love of the music or artist to be that motivated to participate, and that seems to be something that's, you know, probably everybody in the music industry is always trying to grasp, like that magical formula that, you know, happens with groups like the Beatles that you can't quite necessarily replicate, but sometimes just happens and it reaches people.
Yeah, it is really amazing, right? And we just talked about like how it all began from Psy to BTS, but what about the future? Maybe in 10 years from now, do you think the so-called like Korean wave would still be there?
I wish I knew. I don't think I can really say, but I do think what is probably important for creative industries in Korea to continue producing the types of products that appeal to a larger audience is that they're given the space to do so. And that means that the economic industries are set up in a way that a diverse array of voices can be heard. And it's not just the successful formulas that are rewarded and that the same product continues being made. I think that's a trap that's easily fallen into. And that there probably needs to be some effort made to allow for an array of creative voices to be heard. So I certainly hope so. I can't say I really know 10 years down the line.
So, and there's not just BTS, right? As you very rightly brought up in your opening remarks, there is this Parasite, the movie. And also a lot of writers even, just to name a few, we have Han Gang, who is a novelist who won the Booker Prize a few years ago, and also many other very prominent filmmakers. And but we still have this one really important thing, which is the language barrier, right? And what do you think we should do to do with this language barrier thing? Should it be a plus or a minus?
I think that's the skill or the devotion of many K-pop fans who volunteer seemingly endless amounts of their time to subtitle everything from music videos to entertainment shows. And I think that really is a testament to the fact that if the content is there, if the content is attractive, that no matter the language, people will find a way. And I think the same goes for films. And as Director Bong Joon-ho mentioned, that he had made other films in English that involving Hollywood, and those weren't necessarily the ones that broke through. It was the one that had the most universal and compelling story. So I think that goes to show that languages, in many ways, maybe not even a factor, and that that shouldn't be seen as a barrier, and that whatever the product, if it resonates with people, if it has that universality, that people will find it no matter what it takes.
Right, it's the content. Yeah. Well, and on the other hand, I guess language barrier could be even a plus. So I guess it is time for us to wrap up this very interesting session. And I have to thank you guys, Karl, all the way from Chicago, and I'm Jonathan, of course, from London, and you, Victoria. So thank you so much for your great answers, Victoria. I learned a lot from you, although I'm a Korean. And well, how was it for you guys, Jonathan and Karl? I hope you had a great session. We've had a great session. Stay safe, everyone, from COVID virus. Thank you.